Greetings sailors and welcome back to more French destroyers, because I did do a little preview look at them already and they are now kind of in the game, some of them anyway, as part of the promotional event leading up to their full release next patch, or at least mostly full release. They're holding off the tier 10 Kleber for another patch after that. So it's most of the line that's coming out next patch. But, well, basically the purpose of this video is to revisit what I was saying last time, because when we initially got these to test, and what I was talking about when we initially tested these, was the tiers 8, 9 and 10. And I do include Le Terrible with that, which is of course the existing premium tier 8 French destroyer, which is the one that set the pattern for all the rest of them. Because the French high tier experience, I haven't enjoyed it at all, and I think I've made that fairly clear. But once we got a hold of the low and mid tiers, much to my surprise, I discovered that it was actually possible to have some enjoyment out of them. Now this first game is the tier 4, and this is actually Mr. McCavity. You'll be able to find his Twitch channel in the description below. He sent this one to me showing off the Bourrasque here, and it's going to be a rather good game, but it's also very good matchmaking. And I think one of the reasons why this concept of fast smokeless DDs works more at the lower tier is something that you will see a lot in this game. Partly it's that the lower tier play style overall is a little bit more, shall we say, uncoordinated. People don't focus fire as much. There's also maybe less dangerous firepower going around, all things considered. I mean, battleships especially, and even cruisers, they aren't nearly as accurate with their rate of fire, and a lot of them simply don't have also the volume of rate of fire that you have to worry about at the higher tiers. In fact, at tier 4, I don't think there are really any true heavy cruisers that you can possibly face. I think the biggest guns that you can see are... Oh no, that's actually not true. There's Furattaka. I was going to say Kirov, of course, with its 7-inch guns. Does Kirov count as a heavy cruiser with 7-inch guns? I don't know. It's a bit of a weird in-betweeny one, that. But yeah, no, I suppose there is the Furattaka. But you don't exactly have to worry about the weight or volume, you know, the rate of fire from Furattaka or Alba, compared to when you get up to, say, you know, Atagos and Ibukis, and even, you know, Miyokos could put out a fair few shells, even if the rate of fire isn't exactly massive. So that's a real difference at lower tiers. And then, as I intimated as well, it's not exactly... like, things aren't exactly accurate down at this tier either, in fact rather deliberately so, because the earlier tiers of the game, to make up for the not huge amounts of hit points, you don't tend to get laser accuracy on any ship. There have been one or two that were maybe overly accurate that were nerfed with time, and we were actually kind of looking at one of them there, the Kaiser. Although not so much as the König, they did quite... I won't say heavily, I don't know if it was that heavily, but they did nerf the accuracy of the König, because one of the things it had for its smaller caliber of gun at tier 5 was really good accuracy, and that could make it actually really very dangerous against especially broadsiding cruisers, but even enemy battleships. You could still get a buttload of penetrations just because you could hit a lot of shots. Sometimes quantity is its own quality, as the saying goes. So you mostly don't have that to worry about. You also don't really have dangerous secondary guns to worry about. The ranges that you can get your own main guns to can give you a pretty hefty advantage at these tiers. And so you couple all that with the still pretty decent speed. I mean, they're not quite as nippy as the higher tiers, but it all makes for actually a potentially much more enjoyable experience. And I still say potentially because, well, carriers are still an issue. Not so much the tier 4 carriers. I think the lower tiers especially, even though their guns aren't as good. Like the tier 2 and tier 3 have very, very floaty 100mm guns. Tier 4 and Tier 5, in fact, including this, as you're seeing here, have 130mm guns, but again, very floaty ballistics. And I think even the early 139mm guns, they're still relatively floaty. I think it's not till Tier 8 and Le Fantasque that the ballistics start to become a bit more favourable. But despite the unfavourable ballistics, despite the relatively low rate of fire, you can still just put out enough volume of fire overall to be reasonably dangerous. Now, one thing that is a big change, and the main reason why I've put the work in progress tag on this, is these are the work in progress ships that you'll be seeing, this replay and my own replay that's coming after it. The torpedoes are probably the big change between what you're seeing here and what you will be now potentially experiencing yourself with the preview versions of the ships available to everybody. I think as of testing this had 9km torps, and that's not the case anymore. I think it's now, it's either 7 or 7.5, if I remember correctly. They basically made the line, as it initially came out, have a rather disunified set of torp ranges, which they've tidied up considerably, but it's not necessarily been great overall as a change for the line in terms of enjoyability, because I think one of the things that did make the lower tiers I think potentially more enjoyable is that the torps were a lot more usable for their tiers than at the higher tiers, but as it is, I think the line up till the Mogador anyway tops out at 8km torp range. And that's still, having checked on WOW's FT, the Warships Fitting Tool website, which is very handy, and it's worth checking out. Maybe I'll bung the link to that in the description as well, if I remember. But having checked that, most of the line up till, I think, around Tier 7, you could still potentially, you could choose to build around the torpedoes and go for the best possible stealth you can. And you're still going to get outspotted by other destroyers, but against battleships and when there's no aerial spotting and no radar going on, you can make use of the torps. The torps will still be good even if the ranges have dropped versus the test versions of the ships. I myself have just been sticking with pure gun range when it goes to playing around with the ships I've unlocked through the missions, yeah, it's still doable with the lower tiers. You can go for either guns or torps. There's a nice choice between them. I think overall they are still strong with the guns, and I have absolutely been emphasising the maximum gun range I can get, even at the cost of stealth. It's nice to have a line where there is that choice, because there is one set of torps for each ship on the line. There is no choice of, you can have faster, hard to dodge torps that you can drop at closer ranges and maybe get more guaranteed damage but at a higher risk, or else slower long range torps that you can drop from stealth even if you don't have concealment expert and the concealment system. I personally would have liked to see that. That would especially benefit the top end of the line. But that just isn't how they're coming out, unfortunately. I do hold out some hope that there might be something still done for the top of the line, because just looking at the pre-release versions of like Le Fantasque and Mogador especially, at the moment, I would be personally reluctant to play them. My enjoyment of the line through the test ships kind of ends at Tier 7, basically. But yeah, once you get up to those higher tiers and you still have 8km torps and your concealment, even with concealment expert, is pretty much just bumping up against that. And in fact, for the Kleber, who knows, it might even go over 8km with concealment expert. I think they're still fine-tuning that. But yeah, the torps then basically become something that you only ever get to use as a last resort, because unlike these lower range, these lower tier games where you can close to the lower ranges, as Mr. McCavity is doing here. I mean, the Kuma's not an undangerous ship, but it has a fairly limited number of guns. And these battleships have quite a lot of 12-inch guns, but they're not very accurate, and they take a really long time to turn around. You know, that's another factor with low-tier versus high-tier battleships especially, is the turret traverse rates for some battleships at the high tiers get a lot quicker. But as it is, yeah, Maka can get relatively close knowing these turrets are turned the wrong way. He's got these usable torpedoes, although, again, bear in mind it's the test versions of the torps. And even the biggest threat to him, the Kuma, isn't really that big of a threat. Now, if you were doing this in the Le Fantasque, and it was some same-tier battleships, this would be uncomfortably close. You would potentially have secondary guns opening up on you, and if that was any kind of like light cruiser at tier 8, if let's say that was a Chapayev, for example, or what else, one of the US cruisers, you'd be in a really bad spot right now. It's just not a thing you can get away with at the higher tiers unless people are playing really badly. But at the lower tiers, this is a common sight. This is a thing you can do in not just this destroyer, but other destroyers besides. So this is why this line is actually kind of fun at these tiers. This is why this concept actually kind of works at these low and mid tiers. So I don't know what to suggest, really. I really think the top of the line needs something. The middle of the line, as they are in the preview versions, I would be happy to play them once they go live. In fact, I will be playing them because I've got several of the preview ships already. And there we go, we're about to get what would be a double strike, but because this was the test version of the ship, sadly it wasn't. It also would have been a Kraken for this game, but again, a test ship. You can see why Maka wanted somebody to showcase this game. 7 kills is a little bit ridiculous. And hell, if he gets this Kuma, it could be 8, it could be fully 2/3 of the enemy team. At the lower tiers, these ships just kind of work somehow. They really do. Even without the main battery reload booster, even with the terrible concealments and the rather average to... In fact, I don't know about the hit points across the line, but I don't think they're especially high. I think once you get higher up, they get a bit better in terms of hit points. But I mean, one of the things I pressed for with Le Terrible, one of the things I suggested heavily was that Wargaming give it some form of heal. And I think there is something different. My memory's tickling me. There is something different about the hit points on these ships, how the damage is calculated between the different sections of the ships, and I can't remember what it is now. There is something different about these ships in terms of taking damage and hit points, but it's not such a big change as to really make you notice it, especially at high tiers. Something like an actual heal would be ideal. The other suggestion I made was that, and this would help immensely, I think, with the carrier problem, because at the moment you really are just rolling the dice as to whether you get a game with carriers or not, whether you're going to have a decent game or not. You know, you can still have a decent game with a carrier in it, as Maka just proved, but the chance of having a decent game goes down drastically. So what I suggested was that when you pop that speed boost, it actually has an increase in dispersion effect, and maybe it would have a minor increase against surface ships firing at you, but a much bigger increase against people trying to drop bombs or rockets on you. But sadly, despite one or two other CCs really liking that idea, they didn't really show any interest in it. So, you know, sometimes we make the suggestions, we give the feedback, and in terms of suggestions to actually change the gameplay that they have in mind of a ship in any drastic sense, the changes we as CCs are able to make is, I think, a lot more limited than perhaps people might imagine. It's probably not that far off people making suggestions on the forums or whatever. Anyway, so on to the tier 6 now, the Guépard, possibly. I'm not entirely sure how one pronounces this. 139mm guns, so they do hit a lot harder. You now have access to the main battery reload booster for the first time. This is, I think, 8 kilometers as I was testing, I can't remember what captain this would have been with. I can't remember if this was... I think this would have been probably AFT and maybe Concealment Expert. And what I've tended to do more recently is have AFT and Demo Expert. Just for the extra pen, especially the high tiers, the extra pen against cruisers is quite useful. I don't think it really helps much against battleships, but I can't remember offhand. I did do the math at some point. So, yeah, rather floaty arc still, but they do hit a bit harder, and the rate of fire overall's a bit better. One thing you'll notice on this ship, and it's true on a lot of the ships, I think it's true on Le Terrible as well, is the terrible gun angles compared to some of the other gunboat destroyers in-game. And they do have a rather stiff turret traverse overall this line as well. That holds true not just for the high tiers, but really all the way down the line. So, Expert Marksman, kind of a handy skill. Maybe not a must-have, but it certainly doesn't hurt, especially as when you're manoeuvring and swinging about all over the place. You're going to be constantly getting ahead of where your guns can keep up with. So, yeah, and it also means that you're constantly having to give broadside if you want to use your maximum firepower. So it's a fairly awkward trait of the line overall. But it's still workable at this tier, and especially if you have the range to work with, which was what I was going for with this captain build. You can do all right overall, I think. And honestly, the suggestion I made about, you know, a heal or some way of getting some health back, I think it really only would be appropriate at the higher tiers, whereas the increased ability to dodge air attacks would be useful over the entire line. And it's a bit of an awkward, like it's okay in a way. It's fine as far as I'm concerned for Wargaming to have added another line that has an overall higher skill cap, like say British cruisers, which are not really for the faint of heart. I can say exactly the same thing about French destroyers. They're definitely not for the faint of heart. But with the British cruisers, I think the real difference is they can be like, they're squashy, they're easy to kill, but they can still be a serious threat. They have they're a very unbalanced class. They have a very strong set of strengths and a very strong set of weaknesses. Whereas the strengths for the French destroyers are overall less strong than the weaknesses are. So it's unbalanced in a worse way, if that makes any sense. In this game, though, however, the matchmaking's not too bad. This is still fairly comfortable matchmaking. It's tier 7s. I don't think there was anything truly dangerous on the enemy team, unless I was going to play stupidly or get too close. This was also fortunately a standard game, which can result in sometimes very awkward gameplay, which is what you're going to see out of this match, but it does mean that as one of the few destroyers, I didn't need to worry about capping at all, because that's something the French destroyers are really bad at. And this is another way in which the line as a whole is very awkward. If there's only 1 or 2 destroyers per team, and one of them happens to be a French one, you're going to be put at a serious disadvantage when it comes to contesting caps, in a way that I think literally no other destroyer is, except maybe the Brits with their very short-lasting smoke, but they tend to have much better overall concealment. And if there's a carrier in play, then you might as well not bother. So it's basically a problem that already exists in the game, in a very limited form. If you have a tier 10 game and your only destroyer is a Bourrasque and it's a domination game, then chances are they're not going to be going to the caps, because the Bourrasque is really bad for that. But this is now spread out across an entire line, which makes it that much more awkward. And it's especially going to be awkward when they first come out and everyone tries them. And it's probably less of a problem at the moment, because there is a fair amount of RNG in getting the missions out of the boxes. Wargaming gave us, as they usually do, 15 of the premium versions of the crates, which, in my opinion, aren't really worth it, unless you're super duper desperate to have a chance to try one of these ships early. But bear in mind, it's only a chance. in terms of actual money value, the crates aren't really worth, I think, what they're asking. Although it's less bad than the Rogue Wave containers. The Rogue Wave containers were super bad value. But yeah, I was lucky and got Le Fantasque, and I might even... I think I was the only CC that had put their crate numbers into the usual spreadsheet that actually managed to get the Fantasque. So it's heavily weighted towards, you know, the tier 5 and the tier 6, and it's much harder to get the tier 8. But you know, there will be some people playing them at the moment. I have seen some people playing them, but it's not going to be such an issue until the line actually goes live, and then everyone starts playing it, and then yeah, I don't know, we'll see. So at the moment, I've just been playing this as a ranged gunboat. Essentially, I've still lost about a third of my health in the process, but yeah, I've racked up some okay damage. And one of the things, I can't remember if I said this previously when I was previewing the higher tier ones specifically, but I think I might have done. If this line had come out prior to the changes with fire and flooding, which were a bit less dramatic with fires than compared to flooding, but this could have been a really dangerous line overall. If this line had come out, you know, like 2.5 years ago, this could have been known as, you know, the line of baby Khabarovsks running around setting fires and reaping huge amounts of fire damage. But even with the bigger shells, it's still, you know, the fire damage you'll get isn't maybe as effective as it would. Well, it's definitely not as effective as it would potentially have been once upon a time. And given that the guns are the main strengths of these ships overall, yeah, you do rely more, I think, on the gun damage themselves than the gun damage itself, rather than the ability to set fires overall. But I've gotten some fires out of this, but I just think most of my damage so far will have been from the actual gun hits themselves. Maka's game might have been a bit different. I mean, I can't even remember how many fires he set, but I didn't actually... I wasn't provided with score screens for that one. I'm not sure he took them. I think he pulled out the replay, but if it was a game he played on stream, then he wouldn't necessarily have saved the score screens. Hell, this is a game that might seem familiar to some, because this is a game I played on stream. So if you're having a feeling of deja vu, and it was a good few weeks ago at this point, over a month, but yeah, if you have a feeling of deja vu, that is why. So, at the moment, yeah, this match is not looking great. I did mention you can get a bit of weirdness with standard games, and that has really come to pass. We've got our ships really squashed into 1/4 of the map, although we do have scope for pushing up the eastern flank. It's 2 versus 2 on that side. On this side, well, it's 3 versus 2, and our Cesare is about to eat some torpedoes and is going to die very shortly after that, so it's about to be 2 versus 4. And one of the remaining ships on this side is a Gajamada, who has considerably better gun angles than I do and considerably better rate of fire. They can't torp me, that's the only saving grace, but apart from that, yeah, this is a little bit awkward. The Nagata I'm not too worried about gun-wise, but the Miyoko's guns could hurt. The Königsberg actually has the rate of fire to potentially pose a problem. So I really do have to be careful here. I'm trying to play with my speed a little bit, but yeah, I think I'm just gonna, yeah, there we go, pop the speed boost and rely on making it harder for them to hit me. But here's the thing with just the speed boost working as it is, people will eventually adjust their aim. It's like just changing your speed normally. You do see people doing that sometimes. People will and can adjust their aim, whereas if you're just going at straight speed in a constant line, you know, it might be faster than people expect, but eventually they will just adjust their aim. So obviously, you know, don't go in straight lines, that helps, but it's also, and again, coming back to one of the awkwardnesses of this line, you're hindered by the fact that actually, if you want to get all your guns on target, get your best firepower out, you don't have that much wiggle room before your turrets just cannot get where you want them to go. And then in this case, because I am firing at something that's towards the edge of my maximum range, which is pretty respectable, it's 14 point something kilometers. Even just the bit of maneuvering that this unwieldy Nagato is doing is enough for my relatively floaty shells to be missing a lot of the time. And this Nagato is actively maneuvering. So you can pile on all the range and it will help your survivability, but it might not necessarily help with your ability to deal damage. And I could of course pop the reloads, the main battery reload booster, but it won't really help me that much. You do tend to want to save that for dealing with things at closer ranges when you are able to get all your guns on target and make sure that you are definitely going to hit what you're firing at. Whereas if I'm spraying my reload booster salvos downrange at this kind of distance, then there's a good chance that most of them will just miss and it'll be a waste of a consumable. So rather than try and kill us outright, it looks like the Mada or one of the cruisers is actually opting to try and cap. The enemy team are ahead on points at this point, but well, we still have an outside chance here. I mean, it's not looking good, but there is now one defending enemy ship. We've got two ships who've just, there we go, just killed them. And they potentially have a clear shot at the cap. So now it depends on what the enemy team does. If they all pile into the cap, then they would be able to outcap our two ships. But they also have to kill myself and this Scharnhorst first, because otherwise we're just going to decap. And this Nagato is nowhere close to the cap, so that really works in our favour. So I'm now closing the distance. I'm unspotted for the time being, although the Nagato is almost within surface spotting range, because that's how bad my concealment is without Concealment Expert. The Myoko's bailing out, but there's still cap points, so it's the Gajimada that's still there, and there we go. Now, of course, in this kind of engagement, and we saw this in my very first engagement in this game, if this Gajimada has smoke, they can just pop the smoke, and I'll still be spotted by their allies, but they'll have the smoke available. I do, however, get to do a pretty big chunk of damage to them myself, and I've landed some torps, which is nice. I think this might have been... Did I say earlier that this was 8 kilometer torps? I think this might have been 9 kilometer torps. I'm not sure that hit would have been possible with the current version of this ship. But as it was, you know, I've reset the cap. The Scharnhorst has died, unfortunately. It's now just me alone with about a third of my health left. But if I can just keep resetting... At this stage, I'm just playing for time. I just need to play for time. And not die for long enough. Even if I do die, as long as I make sure that our ships can get ahead on points, and it's still 3 versus 2 capping, so you know I have to survive for at least some of this, then potentially we can win this, but this is going to be a really tight game. And honestly, this is the stage where me being in a destroyer with smoke would have made no difference whatsoever, because you can't smoke to shoot what isn't being spotted. It's just one of those situations. But potentially, you know, something I could have been in something with better stealth or better torps or better guns, because there are ships that beat the French easily in all 3 regards. So I'm taking a hefty hammering here. He's not so good, but there's the Gajimada who's decided to actually unmask themselves, and I've landed another torp hit into the Nagato, which is just some nice bonus damage at this stage. But yeah, I just need to get a reset on this Gajimada. If they hadn't unmasked themselves, they'd have kept their points. But as it is, oh, there we go. They were playing with their speed a bit, and I was finding it quite difficult, but eventually I landed that hit, got that defense flag, and while all this has been going on, we managed to cap. So in the end, I managed to save that game, but certainly there are other destroyers that could have managed the same result, I think. And they could have probably done it a bit more comfortably than I was able to. But nonetheless, I had some tools to work with, and I was able to use them effectively. Now, if that had been a game with a carrier in it, there's no way that would have worked. There's no way I would have been able to get unspotted for even brief periods, and potentially the carrier also would have just been able to reset our guys. Now, if we still also had our own carrier alive at that stage, you know, they could have been helping too. They might have been able to reset also, but I think the overall thing would have been in the enemy team's favour under those circumstances. Just because they'd have more people capping and a bigger pool of AA available. So, anyway, yeah, that's my semi-revised opinion on the French destroyer line. As it turns out, the low and mid tiers actually kind of work and can actually be kind of fun, with a couple of provisos, the main one being, is there a carrier in play? But if there isn't, then you can have some quite enjoyable gunboat games, or as I said, you can also try and spec around your torpedoes, which, with the best possible stealth you can get, are fairly usable up until around tier 7. From tier 8 onwards, it gets really difficult to use them, not just because of your ballooning surface concealment, but because the range has stayed the same. It's not gone beyond 8 kilometers, and there's radar, and there's much stealthier destroyers, and more dangerous secondaries, and more accurate gunnery, and a whole host of things. So yeah, the higher tiers still don't work in my opinion. The higher tiers are not worth particularly playing, and I don't think they will be especially popular unless some major changes come out. But if you enjoy a bit of a challenge, then I can tentatively at least recommend the line up until tier 7, because you can actually have some fun in them, even if it does require maybe a little more skill than some of the other destroyer lines in game. So anyway, that's my take on the low and mid tier French destroyers. Hopefully you found this video interesting, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.